2. Choice Interrupted. Chapter 4, Reefer Madness and All That Jazz, The Origins of Pot Prohibition. Given everything you've read in Chapter 3, chances are many of you are wondering, so how on earth did we get here? Why is it that our state and federal laws embrace alcohol, a drug that is a known cause of a frightening array of adverse health effects and behaviors, while criminalizing the use of marijuana, which is seldom associated with such problems? Good question. After all, it wasn't always like this. Throughout most of America's history, marijuana and alcohol were both legal. In 1920, the federal government decided to outlaw booze, yet members of Congress had yet to enact any legal restrictions on the consumption of cannabis. However, by the 1930s, the political climate had changed dramatically. In 1933, the 21st Amendment was ratified, repealing alcohol prohibition. Yet, just 4 years later, on August 2, 1937, President Franklin Roosevelt signed the Marijuana Tax Act into law, ushering in a new form of prohibition, one that remains with us to this day. So what the hell happened? The tide turns. For the first 300 years of our nation's history, American farmers cultivated cannabis, then known exclusively as either hemp or Indian hemp, for its cordage fiber content. Some historians believe that colonists harvested America's first hemp crop in 1611 near Jamestown, Virginia. Shortly thereafter, the British Crown ordered settlers to engage in wide-scale hemp farming, a practice that continued in earnest up until the turn of the 20th century. Even into the early part of the 1900s, the United States Department of Agriculture extolled the virtues of hemp as a high-yield, low-maintenance crop. At that time, Americans no more considered the plant to be a recreational drug than someone today would label corn or soy an intoxicant. Domestically grown cannabis possessed very little THC and was not consumed recreationally. In fact, the term marijuana was not yet a part of the American lexicon. In addition to its industrial uses, much of the public was also familiar with the plant's utility as a medicine. While practicing in India in the early 1800s, Irish physician William O'Shaughnessy first began documenting the medical uses of cannabis, which he later introduced into Western medicine in 1839. By the 1850s, the preparation of oral cannabis extracts became available in U.S. pharmacies, where they remained a staple for the next 60 years. Typically, these products were marketed under the plant's alternative botanical name, Cannabis indica. Unlike industrial varieties of the crop that were grown domestically, pharmaceutical supplies of cannabis were often imported from other countries like India. Despite the drug's widespread availability as a medicine, reported recreational abuses of cannabis were virtually non-existent in the literature of that time. In fact, during congressional hearings leading up to the passage of the Harrison Narcotics Act of 1914, the nation's first federal anti-drug act, witnesses argued against prohibiting cannabis, stating that as a habit-forming drug, its use is almost nil. Congress heeded their advice and excluded marijuana from the statute. By the early 1920s, however, public and political acceptance of cannabis had changed significantly. The plant's popularity as both a commercial crop and folk remedy was on the wane, as competing commercial products like cotton-based textiles and opiate-based medications began to gain a wider share of the market. At the same time, newspapers and law enforcement personnel, primarily in the American Southwest, began reporting on the use of a new, highly dangerous narcotic called marijuana, or as it was typically spelled then, marijuana. From the papers and police officers' salacious accounts of the drug's purported effects, it's unlikely that most Americans had any idea that the so-called loco weed and cannabis hemp were actually one and the same.